Hello and welcome to my channel, I Win to Lose Gaming. In today's video, I'm going to be teaching you guys everything that I know about team building, so that way we can give you guys a nice foundation for how to build teams in Honkai Star Rail. So we're going to be talking about a lot of topics in this video, starting with the free-to-play and early game progression in terms of team building, and then who I actually think is completely safe to raise from an early to mid-game progression perspective. Then I'll be talking about why it's important to focus on weaknesses, and finally how to take into consideration survivability. After that, we'll talk about skill point management, positioning, and finally leveling up your team. So buckle up because we've got a lot to talk about. So I'm going to start by talking about the early game. So every player in this game is going to get 8 completely free characters, with the first one being the Trailblazer or the main character, Dan Heng, March 7th, and then Asta. And then after that, we will be getting Serval, Herta, Natasha, and Ching Che. So me personally, at least eventually, I'm going to be bringing most, if not all of these free-to-play characters up to 20 out of 30. One of the main reasons is so that you can get this Ascension reward, which is 1 free pull by ascending them to level 20 out of 30. Starting off though, you will want to level up your Trailblazer or the MC, and don't hesitate on bringing this character up to the level cap as much as you possibly can. And the reason for this is because MC has 2 elements, the physical element, which is the element that you start with, and the preservation element. And you will really want the preservation Trailblazer later, and the levels that you invest into your Trailblazer character will cross over into the other element. However, do keep in mind that both the traces here, which are the talents, as well as the eidolons, do not cross over between the 2 elements. Now, the second character that I recommend pretty much every player in this game to invest into is Natasha. And Natasha is going to be extremely good, at least for the first, as far as I can see, 6 weeks of this game's release, because she is the only completely free-to-play healer in this game. Unless, of course, you manage to get Bailu, but the chances of that are not only low, but it's also great to actually have 2 healers on your account. She will be a character that you will almost certainly run in one side of your Forgotten Hall teams. Now, after that, you're probably wondering, who else should I invest into? I personally recommend building the following elements of characters: 1 to 2 fire characters, 1 physical DPS, and 1 lightning DPS. So let's talk about the fire characters first. Since pretty much everyone is going to be building the fire Trailblazer, you have 1 of the 2 fire characters covered. And the other fire character can honestly be any of the other 3. There are just so many enemies in the Forgotten Hall up to level 15 where you will absolutely need to break a lot of fire. Now, physical is where it gets a little bit tricky, because Natasha on her own isn't really enough to break enemies' toughness gauges. I highly recommend not only building Natasha, but also a physical DPS. Whether that's Sushang or Clara, if you're lucky enough to get her, both of these characters are going to hugely elevate your account and make Forgotten Halls 11 through 15 much easier. Now, if you aren't able to get either Sushang or Clara, honestly don't worry too much about it, because you might struggle a little bit here and there in a couple of the Forgotten Hall memory stages, but ultimately you can always just eventually level up a lot and crush it just based on a level difference. And depending on what other 5-star characters you end up getting, like for example Welt or Seal, those characters will also allow you to clear some of the harder stages even without a physical DPS. Now, the next element I highly recommend is one from the lightning element. Now, we all get Serval for free, and Serval is a perfectly reasonable choice for this, and we are all able to access Arlen as well. He will also be a great option. If you do get Tingyuan, do keep in mind that she doesn't really have enough breaking power for your lightning breaking needs. Now, do keep in mind that Jing Yuan is coming up next. Well, he's just going to absolutely dominate the lightning DPS category for a while. If you're holding out for him, you can consider waiting on building either Serval or Arlen. These 3 elements actually happen to perfectly split up to both sides of the Forgotten Halls 11 through 15, which is when things get a lot more difficult because you actually need 2 teams to deal with instead of just 1 team like Forgotten Hall 10 and below. So next I want to talk about why it's important to actually focus on enemy weaknesses. Let's take a character that does 1000 base damage as an example. So against a neutral enemy, this character will do 800 damage to that enemy thanks to the 20% resistance that they have to all elements that they are not weak to. Versus a weak enemy, they will have 0% resistance to that element, and therefore they will actually do 1000 damage to an enemy with a weakness. And finally, if you manage to break that enemy's toughness gauge and they are in the broken state, there's a toughness multiplier that goes from 90% to 100%, which leads to you actually doing 1111 damage. So if we compare 1111 to 800 damage, we can see that we are doing 38.8% more damage to a weakness broken enemy in comparison to just using a neutral element against that enemy. Breaking enemies also does a lot of the break type damage, and physical, for example, does the most break type damage, followed by fire as well as some other elements. And that damage, especially in the early to mid game, makes up a large portion of the amount of damage that you actually do to enemies. Now the next topic to talk about is survivability and team archetypes. So there are 2 main team archetypes, at least as of playing through what I've played through so far, and that is the first one being a DPS plus a healer, and the second main archetype of team is a DPS plus 2 shielders. Now the reason for this is because you absolutely need survivability on both teams in your Forgotten Hall run. However, any damage that you take on a team with no healer is basically permanent damage through that battle until, well, the end of that battle or the next battle. But having 2 shielders on the same team is generally enough to keep you alive, even in Forgotten Hall 15. And because most players aren't actually going to get Bailu to have 2 healers, this is why knowing these 2 team archetypes is going to be very important. So next let's talk about what's probably going to be a slightly contentious topic in the community when it comes to theory crafting, potentials and stuff, but that is skill point management. Skill point management is an interesting topic because every situation is so different that it's really hard to make this your priority. However, it is definitely worth keeping in mind when building a team. So I have this chart here where I've also listed out each character's role, path, element, as well as skill point usage, and you can see how I add like a little plus or minus sign to indicate a slight tilt in one direction or the other, at least if this character is played optimally. So let's take a quick look at this team and why it works pretty well. Sushang really likes to spend a lot of skill points, Natasha generates a lot of skill points, Pella generates a lot of skill points, and Serval is a skill point neutral character. So you actually do have a bit of a surplus in skill points for this team, which allows you to heal with Natasha, spam perhaps more skills with Serval, etc, etc. So you can see why that this team does balance out pretty well when it comes to skill points. So something that's worth considering but not really worth always focusing your attention on when it comes to building teams in Honkai Star Rail. Now this next subject is also really interesting, and that is how positioning is factored into team building for your team. There are 2 ways to look at positioning. The first one being, do you want to improve your team's survivability, or do you actually want to improve your team's offensive output? This team here's layout is more designed for survivability, with the tanks at the edges and the DPS and supports on the side. And the reason for that is because different types of characters have different amounts of aggro. Preservation has the highest, with destruction being the second highest, and then we have abundance, harmony, and nihility being third, and finally Hunt and Erudition have the lowest amount of aggro. And once we factor in things like March 7th skill, as well as the Trailblazer skill, then we can shift all the aggro over to the left side of this team. And what that means is that AoE abilities from the enemies that hit the main target plus the characters on the sides of that target will do a lot less damage to your team if they are hitting your Trailblazer, because there is no additional character here on this side for that AoE ability to actually hit. But what if you actually want your team to actually do more damage, funnily enough? What you can actually do is you can shift your main tank, who in this team's case is definitely the Fire Trailblazer, And you can do a layout like this. So Fire Trailblazer is going to be taking most of the damage, especially if you put March 7 shields or use her skill, and therefore Hook and Ting Yun will now be hit by AoE abilities from the enemy that hit one to the left and one to the right. And this way, getting hit actually increases your ultimate gauge as well, so you can build up more ultimates with Hook and more ultimates with Ting Yun to output even more damage for this team. So if survivability you find isn't really the biggest issue, but instead you just need more damage, this is definitely a way to position your characters on your team. Now the last topic I want to talk about is leveling, and why leveling is extremely important. So let's take a look at Forgotten Hall 15 as an example. We can see that the enemies here are level 65. Now when it comes to levels in Honkai Star Rail, it's highly recommended to be within 10 levels of the enemy that you're fighting, especially if you need to break them. And the reason for this is because if you're within 10 levels of your enemy, breaking them will do the usual amount of break that you're used to. However, at 11 levels and lower, you will break them significantly slower. I believe it's at half the rate of the amount of breakage that you're able to do if you're within 10 levels of the enemy. And this doesn't even take into consideration two other huge bonuses you get from leveling, which include less damage mitigation from the enemy's defense stat, as well as higher like DOT damages and break damage from breaking the enemy's gauges. That wraps up this team building guide for Honkai Star Rail. If you would like to see more content like this, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and comment, as that helps out this channel a ton. Also, let me know what kind of guides you would like to see from me in regards to Honkai Star Rail down in the comments below. As always, I appreciate every single one of you. This is I Win to Lose, signing out.